Our first presenter is Deborah Ball, who will be sharing with us exploring the landscape of proper names and their grammatical characteristics to understand how brand names fit in. Deborah has been working in branding, content, marketing, and communications for nearly 10 years, both in the UK and in the US. One special focus has been brand naming, which was a source of inspiration for her to pursue part-time a PhD with the University of Oxford, researching the linguistics of brand names. Deborah, are you ready?
Well, so thank you very much for the introduction. As Anne mentioned, I work full time in the sort of branding industry with a specialty in brand naming. And I've been searching for a long time, figuring out what kind of subject I'd love to investigate a little bit more academically. And so my work sort of tied in with that interest. And so I decided to do a part-time PhD looking at the linguistics of brand names. Which kind of led me into sort of looking at proper names as a whole. So I'm quite early in my doctoral research, about a third of the way through, looking at basically an overview of proper names and how brand names might fit in. The next step would be looking at brand names specifically. So really diving into examples and seeing what I find by applying some of these linguistic theories that have been applied to other kinds of proper names. So I can dig in. So as you can see, you have quite a spread of different kinds of brand names. This is just a few, of course, of what exists out there. But I think it's a good representation of the variety of brand names that you can get. So it can be taken from the existing lexicon. It can be completely made up. Apparently, it can be a letter these days of the alphabet. It can be sort of a mattress firm or a friendly ghost. It can be phrases, expressions, it can be all sorts of things. And apparently this is acceptable for brand names. It kind of shows already that there's an acceptability to the structure and the composition of brand names that you might not find in other kinds of names. And this kind of feeds into, what's conventional in terms of naming structures, depending on the language and culture you come from, social conventions, naming conventions, grammatical control. So what does the language allow you to do? How is it kind of put together? So kind of looking at these, you can see compared to, say, personal names, you might not get this kind of variety. And actually with brand names, you can get personal names that are brand names, whether they're first names or full names or just simply last names. So already we can see quite a variety here. And just to take the first one, Apple. So I've done it in this way just to show you that if you think about Apple, not necessarily with English writing in mind, because in English writing or in English orthography, we do have an initial letter capitalization for proper names, and then we don't for common nouns, but that's not the case with other languages. So this is just to try and think about these brand names as phonological forms. So when you're just thinking about the phonological form Apple, how can you tell simply by listening to it that you mean the fruit or the company name or the brand name or the first name of a woman or a girl or a last name? And as I discovered, also a couple of towns in the US, so also place names. So it's kind of thinking about how can a simple phonological form have so many acceptable reference meanings? How can we tell them apart? Obviously, by itself, that's pretty difficult. So let's just look at some examples of these names in use in sentences so we can figure out what it is that's telling us how it should be correctly interpreted. So for example, we have the apple closest to you, the apples closest to you. That's kind of one to think about. Then the second one, John Apple wrote that novel. Apple wrote that novel. The apples went to the bookshop. Apple is going to school in London. And just to sort of show if you replace that with apples or the apple, it's not going to work. Apple has its headquarters in California. And again, apples or the apple wouldn't work in that case, or would sound pretty strange. And then Apple is recognized globally for its innovative technology. So these kind of show a spread of the different reference and meanings that I was speaking about earlier. And you can see already that, okay, the context tells you a little bit about what the correct interpretation should be for the phonological form Apple. you can see from the first example, the apple or the apples closest to you, this is likely going to be the fruit, of course, and something that's kind of telling you that already, again, outside of English orthography, is the use of the definite determiner. And also that it can be singular and it can be plural. So these are the sort of grammatical elements, I guess, outside of context, outside of orthography, that I'm sort of trying to look for as helping us to make these correct interpretations. The second one, John Apple, so the use of Apple as a last name is a little bit of a strange one. So you have John Apple wrote that novel, clearly sort of an individual called John Apple. Apple wrote that novel, a little bit vague, because it could be Apple as a first name, it could be Apple as a last name, which is quite commonly done in the English language, where we sort of substitute the last name for a personal name. Or the apples went to the bookshop, where you have the definite determiner plus a plural, which would probably indicate to you that yes, it is a last name, but it's probably a couple or a family who are sharing that last name. So the last name, it's kind of a bit of a misleading tangent, but it is kind of telling us that not all proper names are acting the same way. They have some similarities, but actually some differences between them within that category. And then Apple is going to school in London, so a first name likely. Apple's is going to school in London. The Apple is probably going to sound a bit strange. And then Apple has its headquarters in California, likely to be the company. Again, some of the cues could be, maybe less grammatical, though, you don't have the definite determiner there. But having its headquarters in a location is probably going to tell you it's more like the company name rather than something else. Apple is recognized globally for its innovative technology. This is probably the brand that we're talking about, something that's a little bit less tangible than a physical location. It's kind of the brand name that exists and is recognized everywhere. So if you wanted to put this particular brand name or this particular phonological form within different grammatical structures, just to sort of begin to see what it is that's telling us, or what could help to tell us which correct interpretation to go for. So outside of context, the markers that are particularly interesting are the presence or absence of the definite determiner there, and then the use of singular versus plural, at least in the English language. So to begin my exploration into how to understand brand names and how they fit in, I have to sort of look at proper names as the whole category. So as you can see, there's quite a broad range of proper names. You have personal names, and that can be further subdivided into first names, last names, and of course, middle names, nicknames, again, a different sort of tangent there. We have place names, company, brand names, organizations, historical events, books and film titles, but also, just numerous others, such as we name ships, we name swords, we name diseases, names of the month sometimes. So it really can sort of extend quite a lot. And it makes you think about, what is a proper name? How do we categorize and think about properness, and why? So the first place to start for me is to kind of thinking about it at least more linguistically rather than sort of philosophically and other, is to just look at the linguistics literature on proper names. So as that diagram showed, there's all kinds of proper names, but the focus tends to be personal names, especially kind of first names, and then place names when it comes to the linguistics literature. So that's kind of where I started. And the classic seems to be Longobardi's 94 entity movement. So you can see you've got Gianni has called me up. So in English, it's the same meaning, the same sentence. But in Italian, you can have Gianni, the proper name by itself, and you can also have Il Gianni with a determiner, and both are acceptable. So that's kind of an interesting discovery already, is that by looking at another language, things can be revealed that aren't in English. And it's kind of asking the question, is there something going on at the syntactic level rather than necessarily that's being kind of shown at the surface level in Italian that could help us to understand, what makes this proper name proper as such? Like, how is this acceptable in Italian? And is it going on in English? So just to look at the structure a little bit more closely, you have il Gianni. So il would take up that determiner position, and Gianni would take up that nominal position. But then if you just look at the Gianni example, is Gianni staying in the nominal position? Well, according to Longobardi's enter D movement, you have this empty determiner position that Gianni is then filling, leaving a trace in the end position. So what he's kind of proposing is that this movement is happening in Italian at the syntactic level, and you can also see it at the surface level in those different examples. But he also says that it is happening covertly in English as well. It's just not something that you can see, or that's kind of it's happening at the syntactic level. So that was an interesting theory to consider, potentially applying to brand names, is when you think about proper names and their properties, it seems like the proper name will have not just this referent meaning property, but also a determiner-like functional property, similarly to the definite determiner there. And then I came along Barrère and her classic examples, which kind of show this proper name versus common noun kind of flexibility or conversion ability. So her examples are important in that they confirm the importance in the use of the definite determiner in helping us to make these correct interpretations between proper names and common nouns. It also shows how important the singular versus the plural marking can be. And then again, as I mentioned, it highlights that conversion ability. So depending on the grammatical structure that you place these proper names in, it could mean it could signal a proper name, or it could signal a common noun. So this kind of coercibility, as Barrère mentions, is particularly interesting as well. It kind of makes you think about, again, what is proper about these proper names if they're so easily used and coerced into being used as common nouns. And then another layer that was interesting in my reading on the subject was de Klerk, because she explores proper names used as common nouns, but she dives in a lot more into cross-linguistic examples. So again, just like Longobardi and his use of Italian to reveal some things that aren't, I guess, that you can't see in English, she uses in this particular piece of work Belgian, Dutch, and German. And this not only reveals this conversion ability of proper names into common nouns, but it also reveals gender marking as another grammatical marker to potentially consider. So what was interesting with her examples is that she uses, Picasso and Carlo, so personal names, in this case, last names, but also Bosch and Dannon, which are brand names, but importantly, they're product names, which as a different sort of topic potentially to explore in my dissertation, there may be some differences between sort of brand names and product names. As you can see with C and D, so she buys a Bosch or there is another Dannon left in the fridge, it seems like the gender agreement is with the indefinite article feminine with Bosch, the washing machine, but masculine with Dannon, the yogurt. Whereas with the personal names, the neuter indefinite article is used. So it already kind of shows that in different languages, different kinds of proper names, so in this case, these product brand names and personal names are being used in or being treated a little bit differently or behaving differently, grammatically speaking. So it kind of shows the importance of looking at these cross-linguistic examples to see what you can't really see in English, but also this interplay between the context, the grammatical control, and also the social cultural naming conventions that are sort of all helping us to make these interpretations. To summarize, why these particular pieces of work, it just kind of showed to me more than some other pieces of literature that really looking at the grammar is quite fruitful in investigating brand names, particularly because it hasn't really been done a lot. A lot of the work in brand naming tends to be marketing and advertising focused. So it would be interesting to see, okay, when it comes to the definite determiner there, how important is it to help us make a correct interpretation of brand names. You know, what does it mean for these proper names or these brand names to have this determiner-like functional property as well as the referent and the meaning? And, you know, how come it kind of explains to some extent how Apple, for example, can have so many meanings, because the grammar is kind of helping us to do that. Barrère was interesting in this kind of the conversion coercion ability of proper names and common nouns. So not just the determiner as a focus, because sometimes it is helpful, sometimes it isn't, but using the role of the singular versus plural markings to help us as well. So it seems like it's never really one particular thing, it's a number of things that's helping us to make correct interpretations. And then something that will definitely help with the next stage of my research is looking at more cross-linguistic examples. So when I'm building these brand name examples to investigate in my next sort of phase of doctoral research, having a look at what or how they behave in other languages is going to be absolutely key, because English only sort of takes me so far. And it's clear that other languages are going to reveal things at the syntactic level that might not be clear. So that's the importance of looking at other languages. So coming back to the brand name examples that I'd shown earlier, already from looking at the literature and kind of thinking about how we could potentially group them, you have Apple, Kodak, X, Casper, and John Lewis potentially being a group, because no matter how they're created, and in the brand sort of naming world, it tends to be in isolation, you know, as kind of standalone phonological forms outside of context, outside of kind of other, you know, within sentences and things like that. It's just by itself. You kind of realize that these are just phonological forms. It almost doesn't really matter what string of letters you put together outside of sort of naming conventions in terms of, you know, how they're, you know, pronounceability and things like that. But it seems like they're all grouped together, however short or long they are. It's just a phonological form that you're assigning another referent or meaning to. And you can figure out what that referent or meaning is when you put them into a grammatical structure. So potentially those are a group. Dr. Martens, or Doc Martens as it's sometimes called, could be a little bit different because the construction of it is actually, you know, a title plus a name. So a common noun plus a name. So what would be interesting in the next phase of my research is to understand which part is kind of heading that construction. When it's placed within a grammatical structure, does the doctor suddenly have a different role to play? Or is Dr. Martens acting the same way as John Lewis? So that's something to sort of explore a little bit more. And then you have some interesting brand names such as Who Gives a Crap, Fruit of the Loom, these kind of expressions or exclamations. Do they act as one phonological form, as one linguistic whole? Does any part of the brand name interfere with the interpretation? So, for example, the definite determiner of Fruit of the Loom is within the brand name. Is that impactful? I mean, I predict not. I think it's just a whole linguistic form, a whole linguistic construction. But things like mattress firm and the North Face might be a bit more interesting. Mattress firm is, in terms of sort of our English word order conventions, we have the adjective after the noun, which obviously we wouldn't do, but as a brand name is acceptable. Would that impact the sentence or the phrase or the grammar? The North Face in particular, you have the definite determiner within the brand name, but at the beginning. So that I think is quite clear sometimes with a simple online search. Does the definite determiner remain there, or does it disappear? Because technically, as a brand name or a company name, it's the North Face. But when it appears within a phrase or a sentence, it's not the North Face company or the North Face brand. It kind of gets eliminated for whatever reason. So those are sort of potential areas for trying to approach how to categorize not just brand names within proper names, but brand names against each other, so to try and have some sort of pattern or grouping. So what I'll be doing next is applying these linguistic theories to these kinds of brand names, looking at them syntactically, with the key grammatical markers identified, and cross this linguistically to figure out, do brand names behave in the same way as, for example, personal first names or other kinds of proper names? Do brand names behave differently compared to other kinds of brand names? And then tying it back to the business of brand naming. So since they're created often by themselves as standalone phonological forms, it seems like maybe it neglects that grammatical perspective of living within these grammatical structures. And then from a cross-linguistic perspective, once you have brand names living outside their original language, so outside of English, will they then act in a completely different way? Gender agreement. Is there a need to translate it in a totally different way? So all these different things to consider. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Fascinating conversation. If I could just make a quick comment while we're waiting for questions to show up. Your use of mattress firm suggests also not just a straightforward kind of grammatical usage, but how does the play on the word firm, a firm mattress, a solid mattress versus a mattress company, firm being used in two senses, how might that play into what you're talking about in terms of how proper names are formed?
Right. I mean, sometimes it's the purposeful, I guess, contradictory nature of placing some words together. So, for example, when you put mattress firm, it's not quite right, but as a brand name, it's kind of interesting. Something else that I think of is something like Reddit. So the purposeful misspellings of brand names to get attention. So that's when it starts to become perhaps less linguistic and more advertising, marketing focused of playing with English naming conventions for the purposes of getting noticed and obviously financial, economic kind of purposes. But linguistically, it's kind of interesting that then it kind of allows that breach almost of what we would call sort of proper English grammatical use to achieve these other kind of aims, these economic aims.
I enjoyed that very much, Deborah. I'm a linguist too. And I'm wondering, I love the way you used other languages to talk about the processes. In the German case, was the confusion about which gender to use having to do with what you assumed the speaker meant they were buying, the gender of the thing that was being bought, like a painting or a drawing or
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it sounds like that's the outcome of her research piece was,
Okay.
if it was a personal first name, it was one kind of gender marking. And then if it was a brand name, it was another, but a product name, it seemed to be the product, not necessarily, what you would consider as just all brand names or product names being one. It depended on what the product was, which I think would be a great kind of source of research. So I definitely need to dig in a little bit more, because obviously I just kind of looked at that one, but I definitely want to test German and Belgian Dutch further to see if that really does kind of play out in other brand names.
And that leads me to my question, which is I wonder what other languages you could compare and what sort of expertise you would need to access to do that. But I think it's really fruitful because languages are so diverse.
Right. I think it's definitely European languages. So I think it is more accessible and maybe there's more connections. But what would be great, if time allows, are the character-based languages. So looking at, say, Mandarin, where you just don't have the same, it would just be interesting to see how they interpret brand names and other kinds of proper names. I know that there's other things like sort of classifiers and you sort of go into other territories, but that would be a great kind of source of research as well, is to think about, how can Mandarin speakers tell the difference between all these different kinds of proper names?
All right, let me come in with a quick comment here. I'm Hasia. I'm from Ghana. My video is not so good. That's why I've not turned it on. I think I find the research very, very interesting. Structurally, I'm also a linguist. And when you were doing the presentation, I could immediately see, I'm working on a paper that talks about the structure of personal names in Kusal. And this is a language that is spoken in Ghana. So the brand names, I could just see traces of that form in the language I'm talking or discussing. So one could have a whole sentence as a personal name. And orthographically, this is written as one. So trying to analyze it linguistically, then if one is breaking it into the various morphemes, one could see what is a noun, one could see what is a verb, one could see what is an object here and there. And one could see even morphemes that mark some sort of aspectual forms. So I could relate the brand names to the structure of personal names that I'm working on in this language. And that seems very, very interesting, very interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for that, because you're right. When you look at different personal names, especially outside of English, they can be constructed in such a way that they are almost phrases. And I think it sounds like this, your language could be that, but also I think there are others. I'm trying to think, like Native American, where you sort of wonder how can you listen to and tell where it begins and where it ends from a non-native speaker perspective. Same with a brand name, is how do you isolate within a sentence which is the sort of mini sentence that is a personal name or other kind of proper name. So yeah, that does sound like fascinating research.
I believe we have time for one more question or comment.
Ooh, I have a question. Hi, Deborah. It's so
All right.
interesting to see a paper that's squarely in my area as well, because I'm a namer and a linguist too. This is great. It got me thinking, and maybe this might be part of further research that you can do. I'm sure in your experience, there are always clients who say, I want the name to be a verb as well as a noun, which leads to all sorts of confusion. And it just adds another layer of difficulty into the interpretation, as you were talking about here. Like, how do you tell what it is? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? And then, of course, the verbing part of it leads to legal entanglements as well. But yeah, it's such a multi-layered consideration when you're developing these kinds of names.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that there are some companies, as some of you may know, such as Google, who you say Googled, and there are other names that you can verbalize in that way. They become so popular that you just use it as a verb. And then also in some instances, common nouns like a Hoover in the UK at least. But some companies don't want that to happen, don't want that possibility or that acceptability of taking their brand name and making it into a verb or making it into a common noun. So how as a for example, a branding professional, do you prevent that from happening? Because at some point it's in the hands of the public. So yeah, it definitely, from the linguistic perspective, you sort of try and understand what's going on grammatically, but then it's okay from the business perspective, how do you apply those findings?
Thank you so much, Deborah. I wish we had more time to speak. I would like to read one comment from Alexa in the chat, who says, in Central America, I see people using the definite article before personal names, but usually only for women. It's interesting. People say something like, I was at the Mirage Hotel with the Gabi Estaba and, oh dear, and La Mirage con la Gabi. Not sure why. And I'm sorry, Alexa, that I probably just butchered that, but if you want to check her comment in there, perhaps that's a good thing. All right, I think we need to move on then to our second speaker. And again, thank you, Deborah.